Okay, we're expecting a couple more, but I will make a start. So thanks everyone for joining us for what is the final webinar in the current series hosted by the Next Generation Services project team in conjunction with the Knowledge Transfer Network's AI for Services group. So today we're really kind of picking up on a theme that's been integral to the overall project, which I'll say a little bit about, but using and thinking with scenarios to explore uncertainties and what that means for the future of professional services firms. And we've got a great lineup of speakers who I'll be handing over to shortly. In terms of the project, for those that are unfamiliar with it, and just to give a little bit of context about why we've been doing this series and the project, which is funded under the industrial strategy, to give you a bit of context. The project itself is looking at mid-tier legal and accountancy firms and really kind of trying to understand the challenges with respect to AI readiness and helping those firms to think through and understand what that means and the dilemmas in terms of them as organizations, them as businesses, and what it means for working practices within them. There's three core elements to the project, like I said. The first is looking at academic insight. So part of our research team has been looking at the institutional landscape in terms of stakeholders, regulators, and firms to try and understand what the challenges have been, where it's been done effectively, and what lessons can be learnt. The second aspect of the project you're going to hear part of today, and thinking very much about futures within the professions and developing some scenarios with which we're now able to offer a workshop and engage with firms on a one-to-one basis to try and understand what those scenarios may mean for those firms. And the third aspect is broader than the scenarios, but incorporates elements of them, which is using a design sprint approach to work with firms to think about what challenges is it that they particularly perceive that they face, relating, well, where there is potentially an AI or advanced technology solution, and trying to kind of actually strip things back and use that design thinking approach. As a project, we're quite fortunate that we can, and we should have over the summer been offering these design sprints and scenarios workshops in person. Obviously, current circumstances don't allow for that. We've been able to take a number of the workshops online, and we're very keen to be able to offer those to individuals and organizations interested to do that. And if you are interested, please do contact us. We'll put the details in the chat shortly, but you can find more information about us on our project website as well. And similarly with the design sprints, if it is something that your firm would be interested in hearing more about, then please do get in touch. Like I say, we're funded under the industrial strategy. I'm very keen to kind of make sure that we are able to kind of impact as many firms as possible with the offer that we have. There are a number of related aspects to the project. I won't go into these, but there's more information available online. And they've been the subject of some of the previous webinars. So looking at the role of incubators and incubation on tech in the professions, looking at the evolution of professional services and how that kind of is understood in terms of investment and growth. And picking up on the webinar last week, we've got another aspect looking at understanding client side and customer perspectives on innovation in the professions, particularly looking at law in that context. In terms of the webinar series, I mentioned that this is the final webinar in the current series. There have been 8 preceding webinars, and you've got the titles there. I won't go through them, but just to say, you can find all of the recordings on the YouTube channel, which we've now set up, and they will be on the website moving forward as well. So feel free to kind of have a look through. We've had some great speakers over the last 8 weeks. We've got some great speakers today to finish off the series, and very much kind of interested in feedback. If people want to kind of hear more from us as a project team in relation to any of these, all of the aspects of the projects actively relate to what it is that we've been doing as a project and what we can offer in terms of the workshops and the scenarios and the sprints. So I'm happy now to be able to hand over to Hilary Allen. Hilary is part of the project team and will be chairing the session today. So Hilary, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Tim. Thanks for having me. I'm delighted to be involved in this webinar. The Futures piece of work has been one of the most fascinating areas that we've been involved with at the University of Sheffield. And on that, I want to introduce the opening speaker, Gerard Drenth, who's one partner at Norman Partners, an associate fellow from the Saïd Business School, and has been actively engaged in the project and is going to talk to us about the scenario planning methodology. Over to you, Gerard.
Thank you very much. I am double checking you are seeing a green leaf on your screen. Is my screen being shared?
Yes.
Good, let's go. Good afternoon or good morning if people are to the west of us, or good evening if they are to the east of us. I'll talk briefly about what scenario thinking is and what scenarios are and also what they're not. And also mention here and there where I see in my practice and teaching at the school where organizations struggle with the future. And I'll give a few examples of pretty good use of scenario planning. So let me start with a very important statement first. So although scenarios are about the future, obviously, they are actually for the present. We're only interested in useful scenarios. And there's one criteria for usefulness, that is that, and a measure of usefulness, and that is that decisions are actually made differently, and that they're made differently now, not in 20 years or 5 years, no, now. Scenario planning is about doing strategy right now. So doing strategy right now is complicated because we live what we call in Oxford in a tuna world. Turbulence, unpredictable, uncertainty, novelty, and ambiguity makes life for planners and for decision makers and for CEOs very, very hard indeed, also for prime ministers. So how do we make sense of everything that's going around us? And that's one of the areas where scenario planning helps. It helps you to determine what to look out for. Also, what can you ignore? What can you safely ignore? What is noise and what are genuine signals of change? So with the coronavirus, we of course see all these four domains, all these four areas acting simultaneously. And we can see day by day how hard it is to create good policy and good strategy and also execute that. So let me turn to a very important concept, and that is how assumptions feature in scenario planning. It is clear that to be able to function as an individual or as an organization or as a country or as any entity, you need to make assumptions about the future. So I'm assuming that you are assuming that this webinar will be finished in an hour's time, for example. Without making assumptions, you just can't function. And we make assumptions all the time. So Trump is making assumptions about how particular drugs may work. The Revenue Service makes assumptions about tax receipts, and they have to adjust those assumptions, of course. Volvo makes assumptions about the size of the electric car market. Many of the assumptions we make are implicit, and they can be found in what we call the design, the business design for creating value. A business design includes your strategy, but also the culture, the type of people you hire, even the accounting system you implement. And when you choose and settle on a particular design, that design is made for a specific context. You assume that you're, by creating this design, will be creating value in a future context. And that is an assumed future context. Now, when this context changes, and if it changes, you need to change your business design. So what scenario planning is very good at, it helps you to articulate what are the implicit assumptions that are being made on which strategy is based. And it forces you to think about, well, which of those assumptions are absolutely fine to make, people will eat in the future, and which ones of these assumptions are really dangerous and should be challenged. And that is one of the most quoted benefits of doing scenario planning. So when the context is complex, we turn to experts and we ask them to give us a forecast of how many people will be infected, what will the growth rate be next year. Now, I have nothing against models. I studied computer science and econometrics, and I did a lot of modeling in my time, but there's a fundamental problem with models. That is that they are based on the past. And I can find charts like this very easily. There are many of those, and they just illustrate how hard it is to make forecasts when there are fundamental changes in the context taking place, when correlations between variables start to fall down. Models are calibrated on historical data, and that's precisely the problem. You should calibrate them with future data, but unfortunately, Future data isn't here yet until the future has arrived, and then it's too late. So what do? Well, we suggest you augment your toolkit with methods like scenario planning, because scenario planning allow you to take multiple views of what could be the future. It is really unfortunate that forecasting is turned to at a point where, by definition, they are the most unreliable. Just when trends are breaking and when the world doesn't act in the way we thought it would, that's exactly the moment when you shouldn't use forecasts, of course, because they're based on the way that the world used to work. So forecasting focuses on single points. Scenarios focuses on having multiple vantage points from which you can look back at the today. So scenarios are taking you into a future place from which you look back and observe the present, and then have conversations about, would that culture be useful in this particular future? Should we have this particular strategy? Is this M&A approach wise? And it's also a safe place to disagree and to challenge each other. So we often say that scenario planning turns disagreements from a liability to an asset. So scenarios, simply said, are stories of the future. They need to be plausible, so people say, oh, that could happen. They need to be relevant, so they need to describe a particular part of the world that your organization or the scenario user is particularly interested in. And they need to be challenging. Now, challenging is an important concept. People always think that challenging means that it has to be a really bad world, difficult world, a pessimistic world. No, they need to be challenging the mindset. The scenarios need to challenge the mindset that underlies the current strategy, current policy making. Scenarios look at upside as well as downside. So that's very important to realize. So a very simple way to explain how you would use scenarios is, imagine you have 3 different scenarios and they are like different weather systems, and that you've built a plane and you want to test the plane. Well, you obviously put the plane in a wind tunnel and see if the wings come off when you switch it on. So scenarios are like different wind tunnels, and the plane is your policy, is your strategy, is the culture, is the business design of your organization. And you switch the wind tunnel on and check what works and what doesn't work. Few examples of organizations that have used it well. The best known is, I'm sure, Shell, using scenarios in the 70s to imagine a different oil industry landscape, and that made them better prepared for OPEC. The FCA, much more recent, used scenarios to hold a conference to discuss with different stakeholders what could regulation look like in the future and what will be unintended consequences. CDP did scenario work to bring the investment community, the government community, and the investment community and business community together to talk about putting a price on carbon, and that led to the proposals at Paris in COP21. And McGraw-Hill Education used scenarios to better understand that the world that they were working in, which was selling textbooks in the education sector, is much more a world of learning and not of education. So their focus of marketing and strategy went from professors and faculty to students and pupils. So many organizations have used scenarios for many different purposes, for budgeting, for risk management, prototyping new products and services, recruiting, lobbying, visioning, too many to mention in this very short introduction. There's a few examples given by colleagues later on in this webinar. I just want to, before I hand over, make one final point. We're in a very difficult time of the world at the moment. We're in a time of crisis. This is a moment to actually do long-term thinking. And you should look at this time as a time when you're forced to be in a pit stop. You have to now change the tires for a different track. You have to tune the software of the car. You may want to change drivers because you don't want to drive out of the pit with the same car you had back in January. So this is it's a great time to do scenario thinking. I will stop here, Hilary.
Thanks, Gerard. I think, well, a pandemic, nothing quite like it to show you your assumptions and key uncertainties with which to be discussing this. I was drawn there particularly to the sort of context of usefulness of scenarios, and actually about that, the current and looking forward to multiple versions of the future, because I think quite often in business environments, we have that brainstorming and think about it and settle on one version of the future and business plan for that until either it expires because that's the time horizon that we set, or because it ceases to be relevant and effective. So I think that's really expanded our thinking. Just on that point, Gerard, a quick question. When you talk about the future, what sort of time scale do people typically think about with scenarios?
Good question, and a very important question. And my answer is it depends, even though I'm not an economist. It depends on the industry. So social media, FaceTime might look at a future of 1 or 2 years ahead. If you look at the future of the drivetrain in the car industry, you want to look 20, 30, 40 years ahead. We do see time frames collapsing with COVID, because people see that more change can happen in shorter time than they think. So it really depends. The time frame is chosen to reflect industry, the length of the strategy, and where useful scenarios can be imagined.
Thank you. Well, I think that links us quite nicely into our next speaker, Fabian Waller-Stevens, who is the RSA Future of Work Centre, where they've actually developed some scenarios, and he'll be sharing some of that insight now from their work. Over to you.
Great. My slides are working okay. So I'm going to be talking about our scenarios for the future of work in 2035, which we published in early 2019. And we decided to use this approach because we wanted to move beyond the hysteria that is sometimes present in future of work debates about mass automation, with a lot of the debate being driven by forecasts about the number of jobs that robots could replace. And what scenarios allowed us to do was, on the one hand, focus as much on how technology is transforming business models or management practices, not just how it's potentially replacing tasks or jobs. They also allowed us to explore how technology could interact with other forces, such as the health of the global economy or the future of the trade union movement. And we used a particular approach known as morphological analysis. And so I think, adding to what Gerard was saying, there's this quite important point that, unlike more quantitative approaches, scenario planning allows you to model how a complex system might evolve, where there's too many variables to really factor into an economic model in a logical way. And ultimately, our aim was to enable policymakers, employers, and educators to think a little bit more laterally about the future, to prepare for multiple eventualities. And we've done this through several future of work labs, which are design and innovation processes that use the scenarios as provocation. Lastly, a caveat is that they are pre-COVID, and I think the pandemic has left us scratching our heads a little bit about how helpful they currently remain, but I think we're now more confident than ever in the value of this kind of approach. And I'll talk a little bit about how each scenario is still quite relevant in the pandemic context, but also how we're thinking maybe of iterating them slightly to account for what's happened over the last few months. And so what could the future of work look like in 2035? Now, the first scenario is what we call the big tech economy. And this scenario asks, what if technology develops rapidly, leading to widespread automation alongside tech companies entering into new markets? We'd see driverless cars, robots in service industries, 3D printed houses, they're all here, you name it. Unemployment could reach record highs, but insecurity would be tempered somewhat by cheap goods and free public services. However, the ultimate winners would be Chinese and American tech giants, who have now tightened their grip on traditional industries. And there are many ways in which we're seeing some of this already in the pandemic, not only in the widespread, although temporary, levels of unemployment, but there also seems to be a huge shift towards online services, particularly in sectors like healthcare and education, as well as the rise of e-commerce in retail. And we're currently conducting some research which is going to explore in a little bit more detail how COVID will interact with automation. So far, we've already seen that many of the industries that are hardest hit by COVID, like hospitality and non-essential retail, are also those that are considered to be most at risk of automation in the future. But then meanwhile, we've seen industries such as entertainment and tourism that we previously thought were almost completely resilient to technological change on the brink of collapse. The next scenario is what we call the precision economy scenario. And in this scenario, some technologies don't live up to the hype. So we're largely limited to data-driven tech, which is maybe cheaper and simpler, things like the Internet of Things and more basic machine learning algorithms. These kind of technologies become prolific, but we don't really see driverless cars on the road. And what happens here is that businesses install these sensors across their supply chains, meaning that every aspect of the society and the economy is now monitored with precision. So automation remains somewhat limited, but there are big changes in the way that workers are managed. Workers are subject to new levels of algorithmic oversight and a pervasive rating system as gig economy platforms enter new sectors. And for some workers, this improves their work-life balance as they can now work much more flexibly, but for others, they are left to battle it out for piecemeal work. And some of the inspirations behind this scenario, things like the social credit system in China, Uber, of course, technologies like wearables, and the rise in workplace monitoring, employers spying on their workers. And during the pandemic, we've seen quite a few signs that many precision technologies are being adopted by firms, from sensors that buzz to enforce social distancing on construction sites, to heat sensors that could be used to measure how long people who are working from home are staying at their desks. And we've also been reminded of the insecurity that many platform or gig economy workers face who lack basic protections such as sick pay, which are clearly essential in these times. The next scenario is the most positive maybe, or the loveliest of the bunch, and it's called the empathy economy. And in this scenario, technology is stewarded responsibly. So unions and businesses work together to ensure that technology, where it automates, it's automating the dirty, dull and dangerous parts of people's jobs, meanwhile augmenting their human capabilities. In this scenario, we see profits retained in the UK mostly from technological progress. And this means consumers have more money to spend on jobs that are maybe uniquely human and can't be automated at all. So we see a rise in empathy sectors, things like social care, education, but also roles like yoga teachers and massage therapists. But this isn't all positive. Some of this work can be quite emotionally demanding, and there's this, I guess, rise in emotional labor, as well as the fact that a lot of these jobs are gendered roles. And so while there might be some automation for manual roles, bus drivers, manufacturing workers, there's maybe a challenge around how they will transition in this empathy future. And what we've seen with the pandemic actually is maybe it undermining this kind of scenario somewhat, because it has definitely placed a brake on growth in high-touch industries. Meanwhile, it has also highlighted the importance of key workers and the need to improve the status of jobs in sectors such as social care. And this is something that we've constantly tried to speak to through this scenario. Now, the last scenario is the exodus economy, which now feels a little bit too close to home. So in this scenario, we essentially asked, what if a recession would cause technological progress to stall? Domestic middle-sized firms might go under, and industries underpinned by consumer spending are those that would be hardest hit. By and large, the UK could remain stuck in a low-pay, low-productivity paradigm here. Now, we didn't predict the coronavirus pandemic, but we did tell decision makers to prepare for this kind of shock to the economy. And actually, frequently when we've engaged with policymakers and employers using these scenarios, the exodus economy is the one that they have shown the most resistance towards, and often the one that they are least likely to want to discuss. And the scenario gets its name from both a literal and figurative exodus. So as capitalism fails to deliver the goods in this scenario, workers, on the one, some of them take to the streets and protest, others escape to the countryside in search of alternative lifestyles rooted in self-sufficiency. And we've seen already some of this exodus happening, with city life feeling quite tainted by the pandemic. But by and large, the nature and scale of this recession is unlike anything we could have imagined. And I think going forward, we're probably going to look at this scenario and how we might be able to factor in other existential risks, such as climate change, which might be otherwise lacking from the work we've been doing. And now a few things we've been able to do with these scenarios. One, which is really fun, is turn them into much more, I guess, speculative pieces. And so on the one hand, we've worked with the Orwell Foundation to commission a set of short stories from award-winning authors, including Darren McGarvey, who wrote Poverty Safari. Some of you may have read. His story is, I really recommend it. It's quite gritty. Think train spotting in our big tech economy scenario. And we've also worked with an experienced design agency called Glider to produce a set of speculative artifacts, what we call the Future Work Archive, which we use when we host workshops with business or policymakers to really get them thinking and get them out of their comfort zone and really connect with the different values that are underlying in these different visions for the future. And we also started working with a immersive theatre company called Pony to produce a immersive story game. Think something a little bit like Black Mirror's Bandersnatch, for those of you that have watched that. And we were developing this for Nesta's Future Fest, which has now been put on hold due to COVID, but watch out, it may be on next year. And lastly, this is my last slide. We've been using this to structure several design and innovation processes. One with employers and policymakers in the retail sector to iterate the scenarios and understand the different consequences for their industry before trying to co-develop potential solutions with different stakeholders. And as well as doing that with people in the retail sector, we've also done some work with Skills Development Scotland to help inform their vision for the future of the Scottish skills system. And also an RSA fellow at Health Education England has been using these scenarios to inform their workforce planning. And he's actually done his own piece of work using our scenarios, but you can read about that as this program called the Future Doctor Program that they're doing for the NHS. That's everything from me.
Super. Thanks very much there, Fabian. It's I think it's interesting, your opening statement that the starting point for this was to try and move beyond the hysteria and seeing therefore through the discussion of the actual scenarios how this technique can enable that and to draw out some of the assumptions and particularly how some of that is already coming into play and the scenarios provide a mirror with which to do that reflection as events unfold and the future comes forwards to today. I was just interested, can you just very quickly, 1 minute, talk about how you got there, just what was the participative process to the creation of the scenarios, if I may? Yeah,
of course. So we use an approach called morphological analysis, which is considered to be a much more sophisticated approach than using a kind of simple 2x2 matrix, which is often used in consultancy. And so essentially, it's going to be hard to talk about this in a minute, but I'll try. But we started by analysing a list of drivers of change or critical uncertainties. So things that we thought were high impact and high uncertainty. And then we held a series of workshops to try and prioritise those, working with a really wide range, group of different stakeholders, from people investing and developing technology to employers deploying it to trade unions and other thought leaders in the future of work space. And then we went into our process of scenario development, which included like various sessions of various processes of iteration where we did sessions internally, but also externally, again with similar people who had been at that other workshop. And then I guess there's the kind of creative putting together of the scenarios and all of the other spillover activities we've done to really bring them to life. But also because we're looking at quite a high macro level, whole economy almost, we wanted to take them through those further processes of iteration. So in all of those future work labs, we will kind of take the scenarios as a starting point and try and gather more signals of how they're playing out in different industries, and then iterate each future. So you get these kind of much richer sector case studies, if you like.
Yeah, no, that's super helpful, because I think it's, unless you've taken part in it, you don't get a sense of how, you know, it's not just two people in a room, and that actually they're, when done well, they're very multi-stakeholder, multi-party perspectives, and that this is the culmination, and that you're not creating a prediction, but some, you know, scenarios in it. And you link nicely there into our next speaker with sort of taking that approach and then thinking about it in our specific context of the legal and accounting professions and the professional services, and the impact both of technology and other exogenous factors. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Stephen Ward, who is Director of Strategy for the Council for Licensed Conveyancers. Over to you, Stephen. Who's on mute?
And I've just unmuted myself. Hopefully you can see my slides.
We can, there we go.
Great, good. Thanks. I feel sort of a bit, I don't know, of an imposter coming after two people who've thought so very carefully about the use and development of scenarios, because I'll be very honest here and say that this was something new for the CLC, and we sort of jumped in with both feet. I suppose I take a bit of comfort from what Fabian and Gerald have just said as well, because I see that we didn't get it entirely wrong. So that's good to know. It's actually the culmination of several years of work, talking to a huge range of stakeholders, innovative firms that are regulated by the CLC, government agencies from land registry to ministries like MHCLG, people who now work in the pan-industry home buying and selling group, which is trying to reimagine the home buying and selling process, but during COVID has focused on providing advice and support to the industry to keep it moving as far as possible. And of course, technologists and innovators. It's great fun and very invigorating to network with all of these bright young people who are dreaming up disruptive tools that may or may not be adopted, but hold great promise for really just transforming the landscape and the consumer experience particularly, as well as the lawyer experience. What we wanted to do was, what we hoped to do was create a framework for us as a regulator, for the firms we regulate, and for the industry as a whole really, to think about what the future might be like, and to, as Gerard was saying, strategize now, start working towards that, take steps to future-proof their organizations, to future-proof our policy in our case, and so on. It's not AI specific, it's not even just technology, but it is mostly looking at the impact of technology. So I was asked to look quickly at what some of our scenarios are, which I'll do, and then talk about, wait a minute, talk about how we are going to move forward. But 1 second, I'm confused because I have two, an innovation for me in COVID is to have two screens, and there we go. Hopefully you're seeing my second one now. Did the screen change? No, interesting. Right, let me unshare briefly and then see why not. Okay. Screen share. This one share. And now I'm going to go to slideshow. Ah, what is going on here? Here we go. Resume slideshow. Well, you can see my slides, I think, anyway. Yes, good. So it looks like I'll have to work through them in this way. And I should say that when we looked at scenarios, we didn't look at it quite in the way that was on one of Gerard's slides, in terms of these are 5 possible ways that the future could look, but rather we looked a bit more in the way that Fabian was talking about, at different aspects of change and how they could evolve, and what that might mean then for the practice of conveyancing. So our first one was that obviously we've moved to a fully electronic process in 2030. This was largely informed by discussions that we've been having with Land Registry, work they've done on their digital street programme, and all of this was put through the mill by a round table of experts from across the industry, and a number of interviews with, for example, the relevant people at the Law Commission, and so on, to try to understand how we could move forward. And then what we've been doing is asking ourselves and the industry some questions to start thinking about how we need to change. In a fully electronic process, how do we regulate? I'm very excited about getting a backdoor key to the systems that lawyers are using, so I can do very high touch, but also non-intrusive regulation and monitoring. You know, that's a bit like the camera in the bathroom at the workplace. You know, how are we going to move to that? Culturally, is that going to be accepted, and so on. Then there's the bigger question that people keep asking, well, if a lot of the work is done in a black box rather than by the lawyer, who's responsible for the output of the black box? You know, that I think is something we need to explore a bit further. I personally think the lawyer providing the service is still on the hook, so they need to understand what's going on in the black box and how to judge the product of all of that. And another perennial question in legal services is unbundling. So the kinds of tools that we're seeing coming on stream for conveyancing offer the prospect of self-service by the consumer to a degree. There's a question there about, well, does the consumer really want to spend their life savings on a product without the advice of a trusted professional? Or is there some sort of blend, so the consumer does a degree of the work themselves to reduce the price, and then the conveyancer steps in at a different point? So you can see how positing that sort of future threw up a lot of questions for us and for the industry. I don't know why. Yeah, there we go. The second one, and this is something that is bearing some fruit immediately, is that we think we have the opportunity to massively improve the security of the conveyancing process, and particularly the financial aspects of the transactions. Old-fashioned client account is very tempting to fraudsters, whether they're inside or outside firms, and mostly I can say the profession has done a lot of work recently to tackle that, but they're still a juicy target. How could we, as a regulator, set common standards so that there's interoperability between systems? How do the various regulators involved in all of this work together? So in a fully digital process, you can see that the FCA, the regulators of estate agents, which are fledgling, but there, and the regulators of lawyers have overlapping areas of interest. How do we work together to ensure that these new systems, these new tools, are getting the outcomes for consumers that are right and are providing the protections, but that there's not too much of a burden imposed by that overlapping regulation. Next, well, conveyancing is all about data, really. It's about getting data in about the property that's being bought and understanding whether on that basis it's the right thing for the buyer to buy, whether it's going to give them the experience that they want, they're going to be able to use that house in the way they want to. But there are lots of questions there that are thrown up by that we explore in the paper about how do you trust the data? You know, how do we ensure that the data is reliable and that we can really move forward with the assurances from the right people on how that was generated and how it was stored and how it was protected and so on. There's also a question, I think, about creep of quasi-regulation. So as we've got organisations, possibly commercial organisations, setting standards for data creation and retention, how do we ensure that those standards are correct in a public policy sense and are going to give those right outcomes? And how will we prevent that sort of quasi-regulatory creep as other players come in and start placing conditions on the use of tools and so on by the lawyers? And in the data sense as well, there's lots of work going on at the moment about gathering in the information and about storing it on property logbooks in a way that, again, would make transactions smoother, faster, more secure in future and offer a huge possibility for change.
And you've got about 1 more minute.
I'll hurry up, sorry. The conveyancer's role is of course going to change. If the grunt work is done by the machine, then the conveyancer can focus on the added value, the advice to the consumer. That might change how they need to be educated. I mentioned understanding what goes on in the black box. There was a bit of excitement a couple of years ago about lawyers need to learn how to code. I don't think that's right, but I think lawyers need to have a more sophisticated understanding of the effectiveness and the limitations of the different tools that are available to them. The market is going to change, of course, and this is a key issue for talking to firms about how they are going to flex their business model as consumer expectation changes, as the routes to deliver conveyancing services evolve, and that's a key reason why we wanted to go through some of these scenarios. And finally, we as regulators need to be flexible to keep up. I don't say that we can be ahead of the curve, but we can be on the curve with the innovators. Now, we're using all of this in a number of ways. As I said, it's a framework for firms to start planning their own strategy, to start developing and delivering their own strategy. It's shaping our review of our rule book so that we can make sure that that is as future-proofed as possible to not inhibit innovation. And it helps us understand how to focus our effort. We've already changed our accounts code to deal with the tricky problem of client account and make it possible for firms to use third-party managed accounts. And there are lots of other changes like that that will be driven, I think, by the work in here through workshops that have been delayed because of COVID, but will happen in the autumn with firms to look at, so what now that we have all of this, what now? It's not a, I don't think it's a pessimistic vision, but to go back to one of the earlier speakers, it is a very challenging vision for legal services because it is a lot of potentially very radical change, which could be very, very positive, but it's going to be challenging for the firms to evolve through to take advantage of. So I'm sorry for going on too long, and I'll happily take any questions. Thanks
very much. I mean, a great example there of further developing the idea of scenarios and putting them into use, and specifically within the context of the legal services profession. I want to just move quickly, actually, if that's okay, to Lucy, because it segues nicely into the work that we've been doing on the project, thinking about this for legal services, but also accounting and mid-tier firms. So over to Lucy, who is the one of the co-investigators on our project. She's also a Professor of Contemporary Design Practices at UAL. Is your sound okay first? Okay, I saw your message, Lucy.
Can you hear me?
We can.
Okay, all right. So now, yeah, it's been fading in and out, so apologies. Can you see my slides?
Yes, we can.
And Gerard and Hilary. So very briefly, I'm going to share some perspectives from the scenarios of 2030 that we have developed as part of the Next Generation project. Tim gave an overview of the project earlier. So our aim was to enable strategic conversations in the mid-sized, mid-market firms, as well as regulators and professional bodies in the two sectors we're working with through the project, law and accounting. And to do that, we engaged very deeply over the last year, in particular with Gerard from Norman Partners. One of the other co-investigators in the project is from the Managing Partners Forum, which is a membership body for many professional services firms, including law and accounting. And so we ended up with a team of us, including some other colleagues who are here on the call today, developing these scenarios over the past year. And rather like the quick overview that Fabian gave from the RSA scenarios, we also identified some key uncertainties. That was through some desk research we were doing through the project. Firms and regulators and also vendors. We then had a workshop with around 30 people about this time last year, which produced actually 4 scenarios, and then the core team who I've mentioned carried on working on those with under the guidance of Norman Partners to produce the 3 scenarios that we've ended up with. So ours are different to what you've just seen earlier because they are specifically with a focus on mid-size or mid-market professional services firms in the UK. But they are similar in the sense that they are describing the world. They're not describing what firms should do or can do. It's describing the world that these firms might be in. And these are now completed, and at the end I'll show you just at the sort of stages where we can, where we will be looking at dissemination and engagement with them. So and it's a world where AI and digital and data are widely diffused, but unevenly so. And in particular, in the legal and accounting sectors in the UK, there are new entrants with digital and data skills who are able to provide non-protected services in law and accounting. The incumbents. So that's
Lucy, I think we're losing your connection a little bit.
I don't know what to do in this situation with my Wi-Fi. I mean, I've sent the slides through. Maybe if somebody could take over from the project team.
Michaela, I know that you're on the call as well. Do you want to come in and maybe with Hilary, is that?
I didn't hear that, but I can at least, we can do some of the questions while you just
video
solution, if that's okay. There's one here specific for Stephen on the chat, which is in terms of conveyancing, talking about them. There are holes in security around payments and money. Many purchases have lost significant sums to fraud. How will money security improve? Why is it so difficult for banks to track and trace money transfer from account to account by fraudsters? So if we could have your answer in 30 seconds on a significant issue. I'm not underplaying it.
I can't say.
It is a big area, isn't it?
It is a big challenge. I can't say why the banks. I won't address that. But the way that client accounts have been managed, the way they're set up, does make them open to quite sophisticated fraudsters. You see socially engineered frauds. Quite elaborate frauds which involve, establishing fake identities and so on, and posing as the seller of a property, those sorts of things. The sort of digital escrow approaches that are being developed through their checking of identity and so on, and also the strict requirements around payout from those platforms would help close down a lot of that risk. So I think there's a lot of opportunity there for shutting that down.
Thank you. Lucy, we think you might be live again?
Yeah, I've just moved to a different place in case the heat is a problem. I have had that problem before. Can you hear me now?
We can hear you fine. Can we
Okay.
share your screen?
Yeah, I'll share my screen again. Okay, so
We can see.
Thank you. Okay, so I was introducing the three scenarios, the first one is a world where there are new entrants who have expertise in AI and digital and deep pockets and credibility with consumers as a result of regulatory decisions, as well and openness to, with a particular starting in non-protected services. The second scenario we're calling platform domination, where there is a small number of very large firms who have built up and have access to data lakes, and using that data, they are able to keep others out of products and services. And that has implications in particular for small and mid-sized firms. And then the third scenario is a world where there's AI-enabled search across professional services suppliers, which means that clients have different kinds of relationships with their professional services firms that they work with, enabled by highly regulated AI and sharing of data. And this has implications for full service firms and the ways that services are actually delivered. So those are just some headlines from the three scenarios. I'm now going to show you single posters which contain broader elements of these scenarios. So the first one, and these are in draft form. We're currently working on the graphic design of these. So if we take the first scenario, bumpy superhighway, each of them has a common structure, and there are longer text versions as well. But because of the way we're planning to run workshops with firms, we have produced these kind of summary posters. So each of them has this format. If you look at the square I've just highlighted, there's a sort of summary of what the world is like, which has some broader broader things going on in the landscape. And then the second box, which I've just highlighted, is then a specific set of things going on for professional services firms, which I gave you a brief overview of in the comment I just made before. And then each of these other categories, social acceptance and so on, regulation, in the scenarios have different implications. So in the case of the bumpy superhighway, there's wide social acceptance of AI and of automated services. In this world, we saw that professional services would see a lot of consolidation, partly in response to new entrants coming in. We also saw that there might be multiple forms of inconsistent regulation and oversight, hence the term bumpy superhighway. And there are more details, as you can see, on this poster for different aspects, but I'm just giving you a sense of some of the differences. If we, and this one, it leads to, in this world, sorry, there's a huge variation in quality, and cybersecurity is an issue. In the platform domination world, again, there's an assumption about domination of large platforms, such as firms we could name at the moment who have a global footprint and huge domination and huge access to data that they directly have and could continue acquiring. And in professional services, what matters is access to different forms of data, both client data and public data. And so in this world, the data access and management is a more critical issue, and that has particular implications for small firms who are excluded from access to that data, and therefore, in a sense, excluded from being able to deliver services. Another aspect of this future world is there is a consolidation, but it's not as in the previous world that was in response to new entrants. Here, the consolidation is partly about being able to access data, but we saw that there might be roles for small firms and mid-sized firms where there are very specific niches, as well as access to the data. We also saw in this world that the standing of the professions would increase, because the AI enabled services and data would potentially lead to fewer errors and greater consistency. In the third world, the value kaleidoscope, we foresaw the idea of value is refined and reframed, and is more closely tied to issues such as climate emergency and other public issues, and some of the learning coming out from the pandemic. So AI is seen as not is seen as one of the tools for businesses, for regulators, for public services to respond to society's needs. That then has implications for professional services, where AI is built into the delivery of services of different kinds. But that in particular means that clients no longer work in the same way. They can find and assemble project teams of providers for professional services for the specific task that they need to have the specific needs they have. That also has
1 minute left.
Yeah, so that also has implications for standing professions where specialisation is still valued, because the AI search that clients do leads to specific specialists being brought together. And in this world, there's some implications also for code itself and the black box that was mentioned earlier, that this is highly regulated, and this is a sort of a socially accepted and regulated area of life. So those are our 3 scenarios, which we have got now to a stage where we're sharing them more broadly, and we've developed a number of workshop formats to enable leaders in firms and others such as professional bodies to explore these scenarios through a structured set of activities, drawing from the expertise of Gerard and colleagues at Norman Partners. And we're also integrating this into our design sprint methodology, and we're running with Silex regulation, and Stephen from CLC is involved in that sprint in early September. And then these future scenarios are also embedded in our service innovation toolkit, which combines different ways for firms to access insights, including around these potential futures, and explore them for themselves through a facilitated process. And then in the future, we're looking to how to support firms and others in the sector to use these scenarios and this methodology to make them directly useful and usable within mid-sized firm settings. So that's a brief overview. I apologise for the Wi-Fi disruption, and let's hand back to Hilary.
Thanks, Lucy. There was one question actually that I think you covered along the way, so I'll just pick that up now before we wrap up, which was asking about whether this was just a legal services issue with the sort of advance of the Big Four and the accountancy side into the marketplace, and whether this is a broader question. And actually, I think within the scenarios development that came up specifically, didn't it, around in the platform domination one, that there might well be consolidation. So whilst we don't have the answer to that, it has been definitely one of the factors that was considered quite heavily by the wide variety of stakeholders informing in the scenarios developed. As Lucy mentioned, and Tim will no doubt reiterate in a moment, we have actively created these scenarios and will be engaging more and more with firms. So if you are interested in finding out more and using the scenarios that have been developed from the project to aid your own business strategy or around a commonly held challenge, then please do get in touch either through myself, Lucy, or Tim, and we can explore that with you as the tools become developed. But at this point, thank you to all 4 panel speakers. It's been a very interesting tour around the future world, and I don't know which one I feel most encouraged about or not, or whether I just want to go put my head back in the sand. But as a technique, I think it's really illustrated a different way of dealing with such uncertainties. So I'll hand back quickly to Tim.
Okay, thanks, Hilary, and thanks to all of the speakers. I think like the exciting aspect of the scenarios is, again, I think that there's an increasingly receptive audience for this. And like I say, through the project, we're keen to work with any firm across the professions, legal and accounting in particular, that want to kind of use what we've tried to develop and draw in those insights. And obviously the important work that kind of Gerard as part of the team's done, we can see where it's been implemented effectively by the kind of CLC, and obviously the work of the RSA has kind of informed and shaped the way in which I think we've approached and started to think about doing the scenarios as well. So there's definitely a lot there, and it's just great to be able to kind of draw the series of webinars to a close, really, thinking about what it is that we've managed to offer, and a bit of a springboard. So just to kind of reiterate what Hilary had said, that if you do want to get in contact with us and you're interested either in the scenarios work we're doing or the workshops work more generally, and you feel that there's something that we can support you with, please do get in touch. There will be some more events coming out later in the year, and we'll be in touch about those. We know that we've got a community that we've kind of built who dip in and dip out to what we've got. But like I say, if there are things that you want to follow up with us on an individual basis, it'd be great to be able to hear from you, and please do reach out to us as a project as well. So I know it's just gone 1:30. Other people are probably in back-to-back meetings for the rest of the afternoon. So is the nature of a Zoom age. But thanks for your time, and thanks for dialing in across the series of webinars as well. Thanks very much, everyone.